Hello. Today, you will be listening to John Lewis Esposito talking about Islamic Revivalism, Renewal and Reform from the Great World Religions series.
The Islamic world experienced a major transition from the 17th to the 20th centuries as the power, prosperity, and dynamic expansionism of imperial Islam gave way to political disintegration. It was a traumatic period. Social and moral decline spread, followed by the advent of European colonialism throughout much of the Muslim world. Islam possesses a long history and tradition of religious revival and reform in response to perceived compromises in faith and practice. Historical examples of incidents covered in previous lectures that led to the calls for religious revival and reform include the Kharijite secession during the early Islamic period and Shi'i revolts, as well as the development of Islamic law and Sufism. Islamic concepts of reform, Islah, and renewal, Tajdeed, are based in the Quran and in the Sunnah, and both call for return to these sources. Islah or reform is a Quranic term found in chapters 7, 11, and 28, for example, that describes the vocation and activities of prophets. As in Judaism and Christianity, in Islam, prophets are messengers or warners, reformers who call upon a wayward or sinful community to return to God's path. Thus, Muslim reformers called for the realignment of individual and community life with the norms of the Sharia. This Quranic mandate, coupled with God's command to enjoin good and prohibit evil, provides the time-honored rationale for Islamic reformism. Renewal, or Tajdeed, proclaims the belief that an individual, a renewer of Islam, is sent by God at the beginning of each century to restore true Islamic practice and regenerate the Muslim community by returning it to the straight path of Islam. This tradition of renewal, Tajdeed, is based on a saying of the Prophet that God will send to this ummah, Muslim community, at the head of each century those who will renew its faith for it. It was expressed in a number of popular religious forms or beliefs. The most prominent was the idea of the Mahdi, the divinely guided one. In contrast to other reformers or revivalist leaders who simply claimed to be qualified to interpret or reinterpret Islam, a Mahdi, though not a prophet, asserted that he was a divinely appointed and inspired representative of God. While Islamic revivalists claim to simply return to the original teachings of the Quran and the Prophet Muhammad, in fact, they produce new religious interpretations and cultural syntheses to guide their age. Practicing ijtihad, or personal interpretation, of the Quran and Sunnah, great revivalists in the Middle East and South Asia, like Muhammad al-Ghazali, Ibn Taymiyyah, Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, whom we shortly discuss, Shah Wali Allah, claim the right to function as interpreters or reinterpreters, mujtahids, in order to purify and revitalize their societies. Implicit was the belief that the righteous community of Muhammad at Medina sets the norm that all Muslims are to follow. Pre-modern revivalist movements spread across the Islamic world in the 17th and 18th centuries, from Sudan to Sumatra, from Africa to Southeast Asia. The ideological worldviews of revivalists shared common points. The purpose of pre-modern revivalists was not to reinterpret Islam to yield new solutions, but to return to the fundamentals, to the fundamental sources of Islam, the Quran and the Sunnah, to establish or re-establish an authentic community, such as the community of the Prophet. For this reason, they are often popularly referred to as fundamentalist movements, those that return to the fundamentals. The process involved the creation of a socio-moral reform movement governed by Islamic law, a religious community state of true believers, in contrast to existing societies that were no longer seen as truly Islamic. Removal of foreign un-Islamic practices that had infiltrated and corrupted the community was necessary. This included a critique of the ulama, the religious scholars, reform of Sufism, rejection of taqlid, the following of tradition, here seen as the blind following of the scholars of the past, and a return, therefore, to the original teachings of the Quran and Sunnah. Struggle jihad, whether through both moral self-discipline or armed struggle, was required to reassert the rightful place of Islam in society. Muslims who resisted these measures were no longer regarded as Muslims, but were to be numbered among the enemies of God. A series of jihad revivalist movements in the late 18th and 19th centuries led in time to the establishment of several Islamic states. The Wahhabi in Saudi Arabia and in Africa, the Fulani in what is modern-day Nigeria, the Sanusi in Libya, and the Mahdi in the Sudan. The Wahhabi movement in Arabia and the Mahdi in Africa are perhaps the best known of pre-modern Islamic movements. Each has been a formative influence on modern Muslim states, and although similar in some respects, each represents contrasting styles of leadership and reform. A religious leader, Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, who lived from 1703 to 1792, and a local tribal chief or prince, Muhammad ibn Saud, who died in 1765, joined forces to create a united religio-political movement that would subdue large areas of Arabia and leave a religious and political legacy that continues today in modern-day Saudi Arabia. Although popularly called the Wahhabi movement after Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, one of its founders, its own self-designation was the Unitarians, the Muwahhideen, those who practice and uphold monotheism, who worship the one true God. Abdul Wahhab, a jurist and theologian, was dismayed by the condition of his society, which he saw as having degenerated to a condition little better than pre-Islamic Arabia, the Jahiliyyah period of ignorance of Islam. He was appalled by popular religious practices, such as the veneration of Sufi saints in their tombs, which he believed compromised the unity or oneness of God, and that of the Islamic community in Arabia. Abdul Wahhab condemned these and other Sufi practices as pagan superstitions, idolatry, using the term bid'ah, which means deviation from true Islam. It's almost the equivalent of heresy in Christianity. Abdul Wahhab called for a rigorous purification of Islam, a return to fundamentals. The Wahhabi movement waged a rigorous holy war to subdue and once again unite the tribes of Arabia. The warrior missionaries were called the Brotherhood, the Ikhwan. Muslims who disagreed with them were declared enemies of God who must be fought. In contrast to the Mahdist and other revivalist movements, the Wahhabi chose to completely suppress rather than merely reform Sufism. They destroyed not only Sufi shrines, but also other sacred tombs and shrines, including the tombs of the Prophet and his companions and the tomb of Hussein, a major Shi'i holy shrine and place of pilgrimage. This act has affected Wahhabi-Shi'i relations to this day. It influenced Ayatollah Khomeini's call for the overthrow of the House of Saud, the rulers of Saudi Arabia, and conflict between the Sunni majority and Shi'i minority within Saudi Arabia. Some have claimed that Wahhabi influenced the Taliban's destruction of Buddhist monuments in Afghanistan. In contrast to the Wahhabi movement, the Mahdi of the Sudan, like other African revivalists, was a charismatic Sufi leader who initiated a reformist religio-political movement. Muhammad Ahmad, who lived from 1848 to 1885, the founder of the Mahdiya Sufi order, proclaimed himself Mahdi, the divinely guided one, in 1881. Thus he went beyond most other revivalist reformers who claimed the right to interpret Islam and instead claimed to be a divinely appointed and inspired representative of God. The Mahdi established an Islamic community, uniting his followers, and justified waging holy war against other Muslims, in this case Sudan's Ottoman Muslim rulers. He declared them infidels who disobeyed the command of his messenger and his prophet, ruled in a manner not in accord with what God had said, altered the Sharia of our master, Muhammad, the messenger of God, and blasphemed against the faith of God. Sufism was reformed, alcohol, prostitution, gambling, and music were outlawed as foreign Ottoman Egyptian, un-Islamic practices that had corrupted society. From 1885 to 1889, after the Mahdist forces overcame Egyptian forces, an Islamic state was established in Khartoum. The Mahdi had supreme power as God's representative, and the Sharia was its law. Now a transition takes place in the late 19th and 20th centuries. Here, Islamic modernism of the 19th and 20th centuries comes as a response both to the continued internal weaknesses, but also very much to the external political and religio-cultural threat of European colonialism. Like many parts of the world, Muslim societies fell victim to European imperialism. When Europe overpowered North Africa, the Middle East, South and Southeast Asia in the 19th century, reducing most Muslim societies to colonies, many Muslims experienced these defeats as a religious as well as political and cultural crisis. The Muslim world lost its political and cultural sovereignty to Christian Europe, symbolizing the decline of Muslim power and the apparent loss of divine favor and guidance. Colonialism brought European armies and Christian missionaries. Europe legitimated its colonization of large areas of the underdeveloped Muslim world culturally. The French spoke of their mission to civilize, the British, the white man's burden. Missionaries accompanied the armies of bureaucrats, soldiers, traders, and teachers to spread the message of Western Christian religious and cultural superiority. Muslim response to Christian Europe's political and religious penetration and dominance varied significantly, ranging from resistance or warfare, jihad, in defense of Islam, to accommodation, if not outright assimilation, of Western values. The result of Western imperialism for Muslims was a period of self-criticism and reflection on the causes of decline. Responses spanned the spectrum. Secularists blamed an outmoded tradition in Islam and advocated instead a separation of religion and politics and the establishment of a Western-modeled modern nation-state building, from political institutions and the military to education and law. Conservative religious leaders, on the other hand, including most of the ulama, attributed Muslim impotence to divergence from Islam. They variously advocated non-cooperation or rejection of the West, believing that Western Christian ideas and values were dangerous to Muslim faith and culture. They believed that any form of cultural or political accommodation of Western culture was tantamount to betrayal, surrender, if you will, treason. Some concluded that Muslims who no longer lived under Islamic rule in Islamic territory ought to consider themselves in a land of warfare. They advanced either armed struggle, jihad, or emigration, hijrah, to an Islamic territory. This was what they advised. Islamic modernists, on the other hand, sought to respond to, rather than react against, the challenge of Western imperialism. They proclaimed the need for Islamic reform through a process of reinterpretation and selective adaptation, Islamization of Western ideas and technology. Like their 18th century predecessors, Islamic modernists also blamed the internal decline of Muslim societies for their loss of power, backwardness, and inability to respond effectively to European colonialism. They particularly blamed the blind and unquestioned clinging to the past tradition, taqlid. What some regarded as a virtue, following tradition, they now denounced as a blind clinging to tradition and a problem. Modernists stressed the dynamism, flexibility, and adaptability that characterized the early development of Islam, leading to achievements in law, education, and the sciences, as we saw earlier in this course. Islamic modernism sought to reinterpret Islam, to demonstrate its compatibility with modern Western science and thought, and to resist European colonialism and meet the changing circumstances of Muslim life through religious, legal, educational, political, and social reforms. Major reform movements sprang up in the Middle East and South Asia, providing a legacy to reformers and revolutionaries in the 20th and 21st centuries. In the Middle East, Jamal al-Din al-Afghani, who lived from 1838 to 1897, called for religious, scientific, and political reforms in order to defend Islam, strengthen the Muslim community, and ultimately regain independence from the West. He was both a political activist and, if you will, intellectual leader. Afghani's disciple or protege, Muhammad Abdu, who lived from 1849 to 1905, was one of the great religious reformers of modern Islam, whose influence extended literally from North Africa to Southeast Asia. Muhammad Abdu, a prominent member of the ulama, and in late life a Grand Mufti of Egypt, chief religious leader, focused on religious, educational, and social reform rather than politics. As had his predecessors, he blamed Muslim decline on the prevalence of un-Islamic popular religious practices, Sufi passivity and fatalism, and the rigid scholasticism of the traditionalist ulama, who had forbidden fresh religious interpretation. Abdu taught that Islam and science and reason were compatible, making it permissible for Muslims to selectively appropriate aspects of Western civilization that were not contrary to Islam. He provided an Islamic rationale for the selective integration of Islam with modern ideas and institutions. Abdu's most prominent contribution was the distinction between Islam's fundamentals, which do not change. These were limited to matters of worship, for example, the 5 pillars, and those which were subject to change, as social and historical conditions warranted. Issues related to social affairs, such as penal, commercial, and family laws. Abdu was a strong supporter of women's rights. Now, across the world in the Indian subcontinent, Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, who lived from 1817 to 1898, called for a modern, rational reinterpretation of Islam based upon the acceptance of the best that Western thought had to offer. Ahmad Khan responded to the fall of the Mughal Empire in 1857 and British concerns about Muslim loyalty. He advocated a bold reinterpretation of Islam that called for the acceptance of the best that Western thought had to offer. In contrast to Afghani and other Middle Eastern reformers, and even some in South Asia, he preached an acceptance of the political reality of British rule and restricted his Islamic concerns to the Muslims of India, since he believed that political resistance and appeals to pan-Islam were impractical. Ahmad Khan promoted the exercise of ijtihad, reinterpretation, as a means of boldly interpreting or reinterpreting Islam in light of its revealed sources, rather than simply using reason to get back to the original interpretations of Islam. His method departed from 18th century practices, pre-modern 18th century practices, due to his extensive use of reason, the degree to which he reinterpreted Islam, and his borrowing from the West. He taught that Islam was the religion of reason and nature, so that Islam was in total harmony with the laws of nature, and therefore compatible with modern scientific thought. He allowed reason to prevail over the text of the Quran. He called for metaphorical or allegorical rather than literal interpretation of passages that contain miraculous or supernatural language. Khan was particularly supportive of educational reforms that would allow for the development of a new generation of Muslim leaders, equipped to face the challenges and demands of modernity in the West. A later reformer in South Asia, Muhammad Iqbal, who lived from 1875 to 1938, perhaps the most important Indian reformer and poet of the 20th century, was educated in Britain and Germany. He emphasized the dynamism and creativity of Islam, arguing for a reconstruction of religious thought. Iqbal combined an early Islamic education with advanced degrees from Cambridge and Munich in law and philosophy. From the best law school, he earned his law degree and also then a PhD from Germany. This education helped him to recognize the decay and decline of the Muslim community and formulate his process of reform. During Iqbal's lifetime, the critical question of Muslim communal identity was viewed through the lens of the need for independence and national identity, apart from British. The Brits had ruled in India and were ruling. The major question was whether Muslims should join with Hindus in a broad Indian independence movement seeking the creation of a single secular nation state in which Muslims would form a permanent minority, or if Muslims should insist upon their own separate state in which they would be the majority. Iqbal believed in the importance of the Muslim community living as a religio-political state in which Islamic law must reign supreme, since he believed that Islamic law served as both a political and a moral force for Muslims. He did not recognize any separation of the spiritual and temporal, and is regarded by some as one of the fathers of modern-day Pakistan, along with Ali Jinnah. Like other Islamic modernists, Iqbal distinguished between the eternal, immutable principles of Islam and those that were the product of human interpretation, and thus subject to change. He therefore extended and redefined ijtihad, independent reasoning, and ijma', consensus, to allow or legitimate modern legislative assemblies or parliaments to provide consensus for the Muslim community. Rather than the ulama providing this, he advocated that Parliament could do this in the modern state. But he also believed that legislators should keep the advice or seek the advice of experts, including religious scholars. Experts from both traditional and modern disciplines prior to passing legislation. Iqbal was especially important for his Islamization of Western concepts like democracy and parliamentary government. He did not believe that he was creating an Islamic rationale for copying Western values. Rather, he believed that these values were inherent to Islam and the Muslim historical experience. Thus, Iqbal rejected nationalism as a Western tool for dismembering the Muslim world Instead, he emphasized the ideal of an Islamic community that transcended ethnic, racial, and national ties. But while talking a pan-Islamic language, he also realized in the short term the need for nation states, and so supported the foundation of Pakistan as an Islamic republic. Although Islamic modernism existed in different places and contexts, Islamic modernists shared some common teachings and understandings. First of all, the modernists rejected an unquestioned return or dependence on past solutions, in favor of accepting and incorporating change, and proclaimed that Islam was the religion of reason, science, and nature. They reclaimed the progressive, creative past of Islam, the golden age, as it were, whose political and cultural fluorescence demonstrated Islam's ability to produce great empires and civilizations. They stressed that stagnation and decline were caused by blind imitation of the past, taqlid, and the continued survival and revitalization of the Muslim community required a bold reinterpretation, ijtihad, of Islam's religious sources, of Islam's religious tradition. Modernists criticized the popular religious practices of Sufism as responsible for un-Islamic and even superstitious practices that were a major source of decline. Islamic modernism had both positive and negative results. It appealed to only a small elite group of intellectuals, never developed into a popular mass movement that could implement change at a national or regional level. Modernists did not provide a systematic, comprehensive theology or program for legal reform, nor establish effective organizations to continue and implement ideas once the original charismatic leaders passed from the scene. However, it had a long-term influence by emphasizing pride in an Islamic heritage and the dynamic, progressive, rational character of Islam, helping new Muslim generations to see change as an opportunity rather than a threat, and providing the vocabulary for a new Islamic discourse for change and development. Modernists inspired educational reform and national independence movements rooted in religion that harnessed Islam for mass mobilization. Islamic modernism then produced a legacy of reinterpretation that often produced a synthesis of traditional concepts and modern thought to relate Muslim faith and religious tradition to modern realities. But at the same time, we see the emergence of modern Islamic revivalist movements, what some call fundamentalist movements. Some Muslims rejected both conservative and modernist positions in favor of Islamic organizations and an Islamic ideology that combined religious activism and religious ideology. They thought that the conservatives or ulama were too rigid. They thought that Islamic modernists tended, in keying to the West and interpreting Islam, to be westernizers of Islam, in a sense to produce a kind of Protestant Islam or Protestantization of Islam. Two major groups that had enduring influence are the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and the Jamaat-e-Islami, the Islamic Society group of the Indian subcontinent. They're prominent examples of modern revivalist or neo-revivalist Islamic organizations that linked religion to activism, political and social activism. Both movements emerged in the shadow of British colonialism in the mid-20th century, in societies where anti-colonial national independence movements were active. Their leaders, the Muslim Brotherhood's Hassan al-Banna, 1906 to 1949, and the Jamaat's Maulana Abu al-Maududi, who lived from 1903 to 1979, respectively, were pious Muslims whose upbringing and educations exposed them to Islamic education, but also to Islamic modernist thought and Western learning. Both leaders combined religion and activism. They shared a revivalist ideology and established activist organizations that remain vibrant today and have served as an example to others throughout much of the Muslim world. They are the trailblazers in many ways. Both movements were organized and garnered their ideological outlooks from the example of Muhammad in his first Islamic religio-social reformation or revolution to the neo-revivalist movements of the 17th and 18th century. They established communities of true believers, as they saw it, who were committed to the struggle to transform society. Rather than leaving their societies, they organized their followers into an Islamically oriented community in order to form a dynamic nucleus of leaders capable of transforming society from within. Each formed an ideological fraternity that developed a well-knit socio-religious organization with a network of branches and cells. Members were trained and reinforced in their faith and commitment to create a more Islamically oriented state and society. Members underwent a period of training and ideological indoctrination that emphasized religious knowledge and moral fitness and concentrated on moral and social programs. All of this was done out of a belief that the unity of the Brotherhood of Believers must replace the religious, political, and socio-economic factions that divided and weakened the Muslim community. These societies supported religious instruction, youth work, schools, hospitals, religious publications, and social welfare projects in order to create a new generation of leaders, a new social order, a more morally oriented and stronger Muslim society. The actual means of carrying out their visions varied. The Muslim Brotherhood grew rapidly as a mass movement, expanding to include members of the lower and middle classes in both rural and urban areas. The Jamaat, on the other hand, remained a more elitist movement, particularly focused on developing a new core of well-educated and Islamically committed leaders, an alternative elite. The Muslim Brotherhood's dissatisfaction with the Egyptian government's failure to establish an Islamic state escalated into violence, and the assassination of its founder, Hassan al-Banna, culminating in repression of the Brotherhood and a long series of confrontations between the Brotherhood and government. Imprisonments, proscriptions, and executions followed. The Jamaat served as an opposition party within South Asia, in particular within Pakistan, but also in India and other parts of South Asia, working through elections and in the system and through political action, although some of its leaders from time to time, including its founder Maududi, were in prison. Both the Brotherhood and the Jamaat became models that inspired similar movements across the Muslim world. Their founders became the ideologues of contemporary Islamic movements, the people to be read, remembered. They influenced both mainstream and extremist movements. Both gained popular support when they addressed issues that directly concerned a cross-section of society: colonialism, dependence on the West, religious identity, a reappropriation of it, issues of poverty, illiteracy, economic exploitation, education, healthcare, involvement with the material world in the pursuit of social justice, political and social activism were critical components of the neo-revivalist message. They did not simply propagate religion, but called upon Muslims to become better and more involved in society. And indeed, it is these revivalist movements, as typified and in a sense represented by the Muslim Brotherhood and the Jamaat-e-Islami, that, as I said earlier, provide the model across the Muslim world. Muslim Brotherhoods sprang up in Egypt, in Jordan, in Syria, throughout much of the Arab world, and influenced movements in South and Southeast Asia. The Jamaat-e-Islami and its branches could be found in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, in India, in Afghanistan, and the influence of the writings of Hassan al-Banna and Maulana Maududi can be found when we look in the late 20th and 21st centuries across the Muslim world, translated with modern communications, modern printing press, modern technology, translated and disseminated literally from one part of the Muslim world to the other, from urban areas to rural areas, and had an impact then on local and national Islamic organizations and societies as they developed, both in terms of their ideology as well as their actual organization and structure. And so these new movements in countries, responding to their local or national governments, were borrowing from others, appropriating, and then they would build on. As we turn now to the remainder of the course, we will see the impact of these movements from the mid to late 20th century and their significant impact in the late 20th and early 21st centuries.